welcome back, everybody, to another joint episode between the Dogs 24/7 podcast and the Swamp 24/7 podcast. Getting ready for Georgia, Florida on Saturday, 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time, televised on ABC. I am Jordan Hill from Dogs 24/7. We got Swamp 24/7's Graham Hall on with us, and we're going to dig through and talk about Georgia, talk about Florida, get a good feel for both of these teams, understanding that it's going to be a big game between these two rivals and getting in to what promises to be another fun one in Jacksonville. Want to welcome back everybody listening to the podcast, and we've got Swamp 24/7's Graham Hall on, as I mentioned earlier in this podcast. And before we get into this matchup and talk about Florida, Graham, I want to get your thoughts on the news from Wednesday about this game still being a neutral site as the teams leave Jacksonville temporarily, going to Atlanta, going to Tampa. What was your reaction? What do you think about the plans by both of these teams going forward?
Well, I kind of already prepared myself for, I think, the downside, which is that we weren't going to get a home and home because, and someone made this good point, that if fans and coaches and players got a taste of a home and home in this matchup, I don't know if people would want to go back to Jacksonville. No offense whatsoever to Everbank Stadium. I just think that how intense this rivalry is, getting a chance to go to both venues, and I think the rarity for a lot of fans really set up for it would be really exciting to go there. But as you all know, Jordan, you certainly know this, financials is the driving motive for all decisions in college football, whether it's expansion of playoff, expansion of conference, whatever it is, money talks. And if you've followed closely, which I know a lot of people have out there, at how much you've even seen profits rise for the Florida-Georgia matchup in Jacksonville, before 2020, those schools would only make $250,000. I hate to say only because I think any of us would take that in our pocket right now. But now that rate is over $1 million. Last year was $1.25 million. I have no doubt it's going to go up this year and next year. And so the money that these schools are making by even playing elsewhere, I think is just a driving factor in the decision here. I think that Atlanta and Tampa is a best case scenario. I know that there are already some Florida fans out there who are griping, saying, well, Athens is only about an hour and 15 minutes from Atlanta. Well, account for Atlanta traffic, right? Maybe it's going to be 2 hours here. And Florida fans got to go a little bit over 2 hours to get to Tampa. But I think you look at how much those teams have to travel in that span. Georgia's got to go nearly 7 hours to get to Tampa, and Florida has to go 5 hours if you drive at a good pace and avoid those Georgia police to get to Atlanta. So if you're traveling to the game, you're a Florida fan, you got the better deal in my mind, because you only got to go 7 hours if you're going to go to both of those games, and if you're Georgia, you got to go roughly around 9. So for Florida players and coaches, it's going to be a little bit of a better deal here. But I can certainly understand why there were a little bit of gripes in there. But it is a situation that makes a lot of sense to me. I think that both venues, playing in an NFL stadium is kind of a staple of this. The neutral site, as much as I may be in favor of home and home, just makes a ton of sense here, because then neither team can say, well, you only got the best of me because we were playing at your venue, So I think that this makes a lot of sense. I am a little bit saddened it's not going to be in Jacksonville for those 2 years, but it's going to be a better product and a better stadium for fans to enjoy when it does return there in 2028.
Definitely. Super excited to see what Jacksonville looks like, Everbank Stadium looks like by the time we return. And I mean, you hit on a big thing too for me, Graham, with the Jacksonville piece of this. When it does return, I think that payout is going to go up. I mean, I mentioned I'll have a column on Friday just sort of talking about how this all played out. And, a situation close to Georgia Tech announced earlier this year that next year's would-be home game against Georgia is going to be in Mercedes-Benz Stadium. Georgia Tech's getting $10 million for that. So you have to imagine that, that is going to mean a big increase. I think it's one of those things. In my heart, you say, bring it on campus, but in my head, you just say, this makes the most sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that for Florida, I think any team would take $10 million to play wherever. I mean, you could send me to a high school stadium if I'm a college head coach, and I'll play there if that means that we're going to get $10 million into our pocket. I think all ADs would take that as well. I think that the interesting thing is what it could mean for, if you're the city of Gainesville, the city of Athens, and you're a city official there, you're probably vouching for the game to be played in your hometown, because you make millions of dollars in tourism, staying in hotels, fans being there for several days. The restaurants obviously benefit. You're probably more bummed than any of the actual fans are. If you're a fan and you work in city government, you're a little bit bummed about both aspects there. But, money talks, like I said, and the football programs are getting a really good deal here. I think that you're going to be seeing that number. It's interesting how they've done the contracts, because it used to be they locked in a long-term contract with Jacksonville, and now it seems like they're evaluating it on a year-to-year basis. I think that when they return there, and all the financial aspects of it around there, and I hate to get into inflation, I'm not making it political, don't get mad at me, everyone out there, but I think that you're going to be talking about making maybe $3 million a year to play back in Jacksonville. I could easily see that being the case, just knowing how valuable that game is to Jacksonville. And I would be surprised if both Florida and Georgia aren't getting nearly $2 million to play in Mercedes-Benz Stadium and Tampa at Raymond James Stadium. I don't know if they're going to get 10 million, but if I saw that figure out there and I'm the ADs at Georgia and Florida, I'm sitting there being like, hey, we're the SEC program here. Let's get us at least 5 million, hike that baby up a little bit. That absolutely is a number that programs are going to use to say, hey, if I'm traveling 5+ hours to play in Mercedes-Benz Stadium, you got to make it worth my while a little bit, and vice versa. If you're Georgia and you're traveling 7 hours to Tampa for a game here and sending all those buses out there on a Tuesday and Wednesday, I would say, man, pay me a little bit of money. I need to make a little bit more, and that'll make things interesting for what Jacksonville will then have to pay. So, but again, I keep saying it, money is the driving factor here, and both these teams are going to get their money's worth by having to relocate for 2 years.
Well, let's get into this game, Graham, and I'll just sort of start from the top talking about Florida. 4-3, 2-2. It seems like from the outside looking at the program that there's a little bit of momentum. They won 3 of their last 4, the one loss in overtime to Tennessee. What are the vibes around Florida right now? And I specifically want to ask about Billy Napier, who we know came into this season very much on the hot seat.
Well, it's quite interesting. Florida's a lot more confident in their competitive chances than I think the outsiders are. They're of the mind that they're gradually improving, that this locker room hasn't splintered, which in this era of the transfer portal, being able to opt out after 4 games here, I think that's notable. It may be the most important factor for the current standing of Billy Napier, where there still is a chance that you're talking about him returning in 2025, especially if they come out of this daunting November gauntlet with a winning record here. They feel very confident in their chances. They've rallied around each other. They have a good source of veterans who they want to play for. The young players are continuing to improve. DJ Lagway is the most exciting freshman quarterback out there. He can do a lot of things that Graham Mertz, no disrespect to Mertz whatsoever, just simply can't do. If you followed Mertz's tenure at Florida, which both seasons now have been cut short due to injury, which is quite unfortunate, just knowing what he meant to that locker room and that he really got a second chance in Gainesville after so many criticized the decision for him to come to Gainesville, and he was extremely effective, had limited turnovers, only had 3 interceptions last year, and they all bounced off his receivers' hands. But if you look at the numbers last year, this is a guy who threw 89% of his throws under 20 yards last year. He threw into the flat, threw into the backfield, would hit an open receiver 5 to 6 yards out and hope that you can capitalize on a little speed and space here. He was not really a dynamic guy. Even earlier in the season, when they would score, it would be a 12 to 15 play drive that ate up 7-8 minutes of the clock. And while that's certainly an advantage that you'd like to have because you keep a high-powered offense off the field and you take care of the football, that is not a recipe for success, especially in coming from behind, which when you look at the schedule Florida's going to have to face here over the final month of season, starting with Georgia, then going to Texas, facing LSU, Ole Miss, and then Florida State here, which I mentioned high school stadiums. Maybe that's going to be a little bit similar this year, just the way that the Noles are looking right now. No offense, FSU fans. But you look at those 4 games right there, the Gators are more than likely going to need to rally from a deficit. And DJ Lagway has the ability to do just that. I mean, you look at what he did against Kentucky. He had nearly 300 passing yards and only had 7 completions. I mean, the amount of throws that he had over 20 yards, 40-yard receptions as well was incredibly impressive. He's got one of the most accurate deep balls that I have seen in a decade covering the game. And to think that he's a freshman doing that is pretty extraordinary here. And I think that you have him and his ability to get outside the pocket and compensate for some of the offensive line issues that may raise Florida's offensive ceiling a little bit. The other thing is that they have improved in 2 other facets that are huge for them heading into this game. The ground game, which was a huge issue earlier in the season and maybe was a little bit undercovered when you talked about issues that Florida had, because Billy Napier throughout his tenure has kind of had a 60-40 run pass split as a head coach here. They couldn't get the ground game going, and there was a lot that was tied into that. Montreal Johnson missed nearly all of fall camp with an injury. He was the leading rusher for Florida the last 2 seasons here and was one of the top pass catching backs as well, returning this year. He wasn't active, and behind him, you just had a bunch of underclassmen who didn't really have experience, and their offensive line had issues. And last week, Florida had 5 rushing touchdowns from freshman Jaden Baugh. They've had more consistent production on the ground over the last month as well. So making the offense, the ability to be not one-dimensional has been massive for Florida. But really, it's the defense that I think is why Florida feels much more confident than they felt during that first month of the season. They've said time and time again now that the bye week was massive for Florida, not just in getting healthy and taking some accountability and gaining confidence from how the first month of the season went, but it allowed them to simplify a few things on defense. They had made a change in fall camp where Ron Roberts, who was brought in from Auburn in the offseason, was going to be up in the box and was going to actually be calling in the plays, while co-defensive coordinator Austin Armstrong was going to be on the sideline. And I think that there was a little bit of a hiccup there, and guys were making that adjustment throughout the first month of the season. I don't think it was a very timely decision. I'll say that here, but they've simplified some things and taken accountability for the issues earlier on, and they've cut down on missed tackles. This is a team that had double-digit missed tackles for the first 3 FBS games of the season, just had 6 missed tackles against Kentucky last week. So they're doing a lot of things better defensively. They're generating a pass rush. They're having success getting into the backfield. They're not having coverage lapses. But this week, based on the competition, a lot of the promise and the confidence in the defense can be washed away, invalidated, whatever you want to call it, if now that they face tougher competition, they return to their earlier form that they showed against Miami and Texas A&M to begin the season.
I'll ask you specifically about DJ Lagway. Obviously, a lot of attention, and rightfully so. And you mentioned those numbers against Kentucky, Graham. I don't know if I've ever seen anything like that. No completions under 20 yards. What has impressed you the most about DJ? And understanding he's still just a freshman, what areas do you think he needs to improve going forward?
Well, I often say that confidence can be a double-edged sword, and I do think that his confidence as a freshman is extremely notable. To quote Billy Napier, he knows who he is. He is not feeling out of place, even though he's made the jump to the collegiate level and has been on a college campus for 10 months now. There's no sentiment that this is a guy that is still trying to figure out his game and have it translate to the next level. He knows his strengths, using his athleticism, 6'3", nearly 240 pounds, has an extremely capable arm, incredible throw power. But there are aspects of his game that he needs to improve upon, quite frankly. I think that his game management, knowledge certainly is going to need to continue to improve. He's learned the offense, the majority of the offense, but there's always improvements that can be made there. And then I mentioned, confidence being a little bit of a double-edged sword. You can be overly confident and make mistakes here. And I think that we've seen that in the second half against Tennessee. We saw it on a couple plays last week against Kentucky, where he puts passes that, simply aren't open, where he just has too much faith in his ability to make that throw. And sometimes as a young quarterback, you got to know when to try and tuck it and run, make something out of nothing, or throw it away. He took a couple of sacks last week, one in the red area as well, where Florida wasn't able to come away with 7 points because he didn't throw the ball away and took a bad sack, and they had to settle for a field goal. So I think certainly there are aspects of his game he can improve upon, but his confidence, his arm power is, second to none for freshmen out there right now. There's a reason he's the highest rated freshman quarterback, according to Pro Football Focus. He's very capable. I think that you haven't seen him use his legs as much as he is able to. That's an aspect of his game that is pretty intriguing to me, because you can't really afford another injury at signal caller if you're Florida, because behind him you got a preferred walk-on quarterback in Aiden Warner, who transferred from Yale. And even though he's got a genius Ivy League mind, I don't know how much you're going to want to trust him to lead the reins against these gauntlet of, top 15, top 5 teams that Florida's going to face. So protecting DJ Lagway, telling him that he's got to slide and get down rather than try and run over guys in the front seven is absolutely something that Florida, from a play calling perspective, has to account for. And you have to make sure that a confident quarterback is willing to give himself up, which he didn't have to do too much at the high school level. So those are areas that he certainly needs to improve upon, but there's a lot to like. And there's a reason why Kirby Smart was pretty, profuse in his praise of him, calling him rare. And I agree with that. You don't see what he can do too often from freshman quarterbacks.
Yeah, Kirby very clearly thinks highly of DJ Lagway. So, pointed out that I thought was really interesting. He talked about how good of a job he does in the pocket and navigating. And he said, a guy as young as he is, you don't see that all the time. Graham, I want to talk about the run game too. You mentioned Montrell Johnson, guy that's been dealing with injury. What's the latest as we sit here talking on Thursday afternoon? And what do you make of this run game, whether or not Montrell's able to play?
That's a good question. I think that when you look at the questionable designation, you would think, okay, it's likely that he's not, but they describe that as 50-50, which honestly wasn't the definition in my book, but I guess that's the one that we're going to use. So I'm going to go with that. Maybe that's the cop-out answer. Maybe 50-50 that he takes the field. We've seen several guys this year who were listed as questionable end up going through pregame warmups and then not playing a game. And then we've seen some guys who were questionable on Thursday be cleared and play in a game and play 40, 50 snaps. So I really do think it's questionable whether he plays or not. I think that you also have to look at the Billy Napier, philosophy. And I'm not saying that Billy Napier is influencing the medical staff, but I do think that the medical staff is evaluating how Florida is using guys in practice. And this coaching staff has emphasized resting up veterans in practice when they already know what they have in them and they don't need to, take the lion's share of the reps. And I think that's the case with several offensive linemen that Florida's had in recent weeks. Austin Barber was questionable for 2 straight weeks, and then he played in those games and played every snap. I think that it makes a lot of sense if you know what you have in guys. And I think that could be the case with Damian George Jr. as well this week, who was listed as questionable, Florida starting right guard. I think that there's a good chance that he ends up playing in the game just based off of that belief. And I think that with Montrell, who had that injury to his knee in fall camp, now suffers another knee injury in Florida's loss at Tennessee, they're probably just being overly cautious with him. And he's going to want to return to the field knowing that it's his senior year. And he hasn't really had the year that he desired, wanted to be 1,000-yard back, but has already missed a handful of games here. I think that he's going to attempt to give it a go, but Florida can take solace in knowing that Jaden Baugh has been extremely impressive. Just like Kirby was praising DJ Lagway, he absolutely praised yesterday on Wednesday. He praised Jaden Baugh. That was a guy that, programs like Alabama, Ole Miss, were all looking at him. He was even being scouted as a linebacker because he was a two-way player at the high school level. He was extremely effective last week against Kentucky. We mentioned all those long throws from DJ Lagway. None of them led to touchdowns. Florida got into the red zone and then had to rely on rushing the football to get it in for 6. And that's where Jaden Baugh really did well. He is an agile running back, has great feet, has very patient runner, great vision as well, made guys miss, does not look like a freshman rusher. So Florida can take some solace in knowing that if Montrell can't give it a go against the Bulldogs, that they got a freshman running back who's coming in with a lot of momentum, who just had a very effective performance, got over 100 yards on the ground, and they can, put their full confidence in him. Where I don't think he's as good as Johnson is as a pass catching back out of the backfield. And if they don't have him, they don't have Eugene Wilson, that's going to take away an element of the Florida offense that they've relied upon a good bit. The 12 personnel, throwing into the flat, having an extra blocker there, and relying on one of these athletic guys to go make someone miss, you're not going to have a very capable pass catching back. I think Jaden can do it, but I don't think he has the experience that Johnson has. So I'm definitely interested to see if Florida alters the offense a little bit if Montrell Johnson can't go.
Jaden Baugh, a Georgia native who Kirby said had been in Athens at a 7-on-7 when he was in ninth grade. So Georgia knows Jaden Baugh pretty well. You mentioned Eugene Wilson. He's not going to be able to go against Georgia. How significant do you think his absence is going to be? And who are the other skilled players we haven't talked about on offense that Georgia fans should keep an eye out for?
Yeah, Florida's, no stranger to playing without Eugene Wilson. It's quite unfortunate for him that he's been dynamic when he's been out there. You can utilize him out of the backfield, send him on end arounds, jet sweeps, and he has fantastic ability to make guys miss in the open field. But last year, he missed a handful of games due to a concussion. This year, he had a knee injury that he suffered in week 2 against Samford that they didn't think it was going to require surgery. Ultimately, they had to do a little scope in there, and he missed nearly a month this season. He returned for the last 2 weeks, had 5 catches against Tennessee for 35 yards, and he had 1 catch for 40 yards against Kentucky last week. Sometime in that time, whether it was the Kentucky game, whether it was in practice here, he has suffered another injury apparently, and he is going to miss that game. That is going to make Florida have to rely not just on the transfer wide receivers, who I think have been really impressive for them, and Chimere Dike and Elijah Badger, who transferred from Wisconsin and Arizona State respectively, but they're going to have to rely on an underclassman as well. I think that if you look at what Florida used against Mississippi State when they didn't have Eugene Wilson, I think the most obvious candidate is Aiden Mizell. That's a guy who has seen his snaps waver a little bit here. And, there have been times where he's been on the field for 30 plus snaps, and times he's only gotten 5 or 11 snaps in a game. So I think that with Eugene Wilson out, he makes the most sense to be in that slot guy for Florida. But they also have a ton of confidence in the freshman wide receivers that they have. Tank Hawkins is probably the fastest guy on the team, with Aiden Mizell being right there behind him. And TJ Abrams, who has missed the previous 2 games, has worked on special teams as well, but has shown some ability at wideout. I think that they're going to get an extended usage here for Florida. But also, I mentioned the 12 personnel. The Gators are going to use 2 tight ends at a high rate, and one of them in Arliss Boardingham is an athletic tight end. Hayden Hansen has a lot of size as well, but Arliss Boardingham seems like an obvious candidate to have a little bit more of an extended usage as well in the passing game with Eugene Wilson out.
Flipping over to the defense, Graham, what do you feel like is the Florida defense's greatest strengths? And sort of going off of what I asked about the skilled players, who are the names to know on the Florida defense?
I think the linebacker unit has been sneaky good in a sense here. Maybe they don't have the statistics that you would look at and be like, oh, those guys are incredible. But you look at Shamar James, he has been really effective throughout all 3 seasons now that he's been in Gainesville. Grayson Howard, right now he's got to be a top 2, top 3 addition that Florida made in the transfer portal. He had a great season there at South Carolina, and then comes to Florida. Florida finished second in his recruitment. And, there always is something, they say, if you're not first, you're last. Well, in the transfer portal era, you can be second, and that could end up being first a year later. So that's why you fight until the very end for a lot of these guys. And Grayson Howard has been just fantastic for Florida this season, has just been in the backfield. He wraps up extremely well. He's very knowledgeable, seems a lot more mature than a guy who's 19, 20 years old. So I think that unit is probably the one that I would say is a strength for the Gators right now. The defensive front is a little bit more difficult to evaluate, because I think at times that Florida has had really good production from the interior defensive lineman in Cam Jackson, who, again, statistics aren't going to indicate how good he's been. Caleb Banks has a lot of talent. It's kind of about putting it all together for him. Desmond Watson, a guy who maybe all the headlines have been about his weight. I think that's a bit unfair. He's been very effective for Florida and has played more snaps than I think a lot of people envision for a guy who is nearly 450 pounds, coming into the season here. He moves better than that, and he obviously clogs up, running lanes for the opposition. He's been really good as well. The edge unit has probably been the one that has underperformed for Florida. It was the unit that Florida head coach Billy Napier said was the deepest one on the team before the season, but they weren't able to generate pressure when they would like. And obviously there's more that goes into that, because if you don't cover well, in the third level here. It doesn't matter who you got. I don't care if you got, JJ Watt out there, man. You're not going to get time to get to the quarterback if guys are getting open really quickly and the quarterback has time to get rid of the ball because he's got an open receiver. So a lot of the pass rush issues are so tied to how Florida has covered. But when you saw guys like Jason Marshall and Devin Moore, who was Florida's highest graded player last year, even though he was pretty banged up, when they've had, success in single coverage, the pass rush has been able to get home, even if they haven't gotten sacks that have been able to affect the quarterback at a high rate this season. So we have seen that improve in recent weeks. I think one of the other aspects for the pass rush and the edge unit has been Jack Pyburn's return. That was a guy who in this game last year tore his ACL, recovered really, really quickly. He attacked his recovery. He was back, I think, within 6.5 months from a torn ACL, and he has been really effective really since that Mississippi State game at not just, getting to the quarterback, but doing his job, blowing up the side of the offensive line, getting to the running back. He has been very, very effective, and he's the guy that you want to play for. He's, a consummate pro in a way, a great teammate, and he's done a really, really good job. And I think it's no surprise that Florida's recent uptick in success, in the trenches along the line of scrimmage has been because he's been playing a much larger role. I think the huge question, and not to jump ahead of you, is will Florida be able to cover as well as they have recently with Jason Marshall Jr. out for that game? I mean, he exited midway through the Kentucky game, and he looked like he was in a whole lot of pain. I don't want to speculate on injuries, but from peering through the binoculars, like, an eavesdropper that I am, I looked like they had to, relocate his shoulder on the sideline. And that is one that can go either way because you never know if the labrum is going to be injured. You don't know what it's going to require. There's sometimes guys just swell up and they're able to play within a couple of weeks, but now they've determined, and that was initially the hope, but now they've determined that he is going to need surgery and he's going to be out for the season. It's his labrum that was impacted by that injury. So Florida loses their top corner in this contest while facing the SEC's top passer from a year ago in Carson Beck. So are there going to be coverage lapses, which we saw last year, if Florida has to rely upon some of these unproven or inexperienced underclassmen, I should say, and Dijon Johnson, and they're already missing Jakeem Jackson as well. You saw at the end of that game, Florida had to turn to a guy who a lot of people know in Cormani McClain, but a guy who arrived pretty late to Gainesville, is a preferred walk-on, still has room to grow, can continue maturing, learning the defense. Are you going to be able to put him out there for 50, 60 snaps in this game? Or are you going to play another freshman in, whether it's Jameer Grimsley or Teddy Foster, whoever it is, they're going to lack the experience and production of Jason Marshall Jr. That is probably the biggest loss. No disrespect to Eugene Wilson. And it's the biggest loss heading into this game is that Florida is without Jason Marshall Jr., who earlier in the year was, according to PFF, the highest graded corner in man coverage this season. And not having him is going to affect all areas of the defense.
We're going to take a quick break. We'll flip the script. I'll let Graham ask some questions about the Bulldogs, and we'll talk about this specific matchup, what we've been hearing in the lead up to this game, and what we expect to see on Saturday. All right, Graham, the floor is yours. Feel free to hit me up with what you want to know about Georgia. I'll do my best to fill you in.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that Carson Beck is a name that most fans are familiar with. If they aren't, they probably have their head somewhere buried in the sand because he led the SEC last year in passing yards and is playing for a program that is as high profile as they come right now. But it's really interesting. He's had a couple of performances this year that have made me scratch my head a little bit, and I've wondered whether it's the talent around him, maybe that overconfidence that I mentioned earlier, or maybe he's just gotten downright unlucky. He had his third interception performance of the year against Texas 2 weeks ago, had under 200 passing yards. Is there areas of Carson Beck's game in your mind that still need to improve upon, or has he just gotten a little bit unlucky facing defenses that know what he can do and have film on him and have scouted him? Are there areas that you'd like to see him improve, and how confident are you that he's going to make those improvements on Saturday?
Well, I've really looked at this game, Graham, as the chance for Carson Beck to prove it. And the thing that has kept me from really hitting the panic button with Carson is I don't think he's been playing 100%. He hurt his shoulder back in week 3 against Kentucky, kind of had an awkward fall. And the reason I kind of lean and point to that is I think about specific throws he's made where it just boils down to he didn't get enough on the football. He had a pick in the Alabama game that just he short armed the ball. That the game against Texas, he had a very similar situation. Very inaccurate at Texas. I thought that was his worst start of the year. And he basically copped to it after the game and said, yeah, I just didn't really feel right tonight. He said he kind of felt like he got in a groove in the fourth quarter, which was big for Georgia because, they put Texas away kind of late in the third quarter, early in the fourth. But no, I mean, I see this as, a situation with one, there's no denying that the skill players around him aren't quite as good, especially at wide receiver, than they were last year, and tight end too. No Lad McConkey, no Brock Bowers, and I'd even throw in Marcus Rosemy-Jackson, who was a veteran, who was a guy that had been in this program for a long time. I think in some aspects that has hurt. Now they've got playmakers. Arian Smith leads this team in receiving. He's come through and gotten past some drops that have been really critical early in the year. Obviously, Trevor Etienne. I feel like the two podcasts we've done this week talking Florida, I've managed to not mention Trevor Etienne until about half an hour in, but obviously he's a big part of the conversation. He's been really impressive. But to go back to Carson Beck, he's got 8 interceptions so far. He had 6 all of last year. I would say not all 8 of them have been on him. There's been some miscommunication. There's been situations that, he it wasn't totally on Carson Beck, but at the same time, there's no denying he has not played up to what people thought. How much of it is injury? How much is just, like you said, defenses have faced him and they know how to affect him? I really circle Saturday as basically the chance for him to prove that, okay, I've worked past that. I had a bye week. I had a chance to get healthy. Obviously, they were still busy and doing things during the bye week, but a good chance to heal up because, it's no guarantee at this point that Georgia's going to make the college football playoff. I mean, they've still got some big games ahead, and this is a Florida team that's hungry. So I'll be watching Carson Beck really closely. I think he's still got a lot to prove going into this game.
Yeah, he's certainly not the only banged up player that is on this Georgia team that has been critical to their success. Before I get into that, though, I can't believe you brought up Trevor Etienne because I'm trying to make Florida fans want to listen to this episode. So thank you for killing, I guess, the interest right there. But in all seriousness, this is a Georgia team that has been without some critical starters for much of the year. What are you hearing about Tate Ratledge and how much – I know he's been effective, but Michael Williams, where is he at right now? And I may have missed it, but Smail Mondon Jr., getting him back, how huge would that be, whether it's even this week or beyond, knowing that Georgia still has a whole ton of things to play for and is looking to return to the college football playoff?
I'll start with the good news and start with Tate Ratledge. He's probable. I do think he's going to play. Now, we'll see if he's on kind of a pitch count, but he was warming up before the Texas game, and I thought it looked pretty good. I was still not convinced he would play, and he ultimately didn't. But to get another week, I think that's big. To get him back out there, I think that's going to help an offensive line that has been hit and miss. I think on the whole, they've done a good job in pass protection. Run blocking has just – Trevor Etienne has really earned – his spot at Georgia with some of the plays he's made where the blocking hasn't been there, and he just makes one swift cut and he's on his way to, even if it's not a big run, he tends to make 2 or 3 yard runs into 7 or 8, and that adds up over the course of the game. Michael Williams, he looked great against Texas. I think him getting another week to work past that ankle injury will be big. He was one of the players of the game in Austin. I think getting that week to continue to recover from an ankle injury he suffered in the season opener will be big. And Smail Mondon already ruled out. I don't know when they're going to get him back. And I'll be honest, Graham, the inside linebackers continue to be the biggest question mark on this Georgia defense. not having Smile, a guy that's been around for a long time, played a lot of snaps. You're relying on C.J. Allen. You're relying on Raylan Wilson, a pair of sophomores who I'll give them credit. I thought they played better against Texas. The Mississippi State game, I mean, it just didn't even seem like they were out there, that they really factored in. And I think that was part of the reason the defense struggled in that game against Mississippi State. So, yeah, I mean, there's some significant absences going into this game. I'll mention too, Branson Robinson not being able to play as he deals with an MCL strain. So there's going to be a lot put on Trevor Etienne as well as freshman Nate Frazier when it comes to the run game. But they've continued to make it work. It's not been pretty. Georgia, I think, is 14th in the SEC in rushing yards per game, but they've still done enough to win, and I think they'll do that once again on Saturday.
Yeah, it's quite interesting that you mentioned the inside linebacker room being a question mark, because when I looked at these, Georgia defensive statistics, again, statistics aren't going to tell the full story here, but it was hard for me to find an issue with this Georgia defense. And fans obviously know how well they've recruited in recent years. It's kind of been someone goes down, you plug someone else in, and that guy was a 5-star here. But, what are some of the strengths of this Georgia defense in your mind right now? And you can pinpoint guys that you think are playing exceptionally well. And what are some of the weaknesses outside of the inside linebacker room, or some facets of the game where defensively Georgia is leaving a little bit to be desired right now?
Starting with the strengths, I would say the run stopping. I mean, I think they've done really good against the run. I think that I wrote about Nazir Stackhouse earlier this week, and he's one of those unsung heroes on this defense. I mean, a nose tackle, you look at his numbers, they're not, they don't pop off the page, but he does such a great job of being consistent. He's getting ready to make like his 37th consecutive start. And think about what a nose tackle goes up against, especially in the SEC every single week. I mean, to have him has been huge. You kind of go back to that Texas game of finally seeing what you wanted to from this pass rush. It just seemed like not having Mykel Williams for the longest time, having Warren Brinson banged up, not having Jordan Hall, who still hasn't played. I do think the Jacksonville native is going to be able to make his season debut on Saturday. They finally were closer to 100%, as close as they've been since the start of the season against Texas, and it showed up. 10 tackles for loss, 7 sacks, forced 4 turnovers. I mean, if they can get after DJ Lagway like they did in Austin, I think that sets up really well. And I would be remiss not to mention Jalen Walker, who is a huge part of that pass rush, a guy that I think is well on his way to being a first-round pick, a guy that I would say through 7 games has been Georgia's defensive MVP. I mean, he's just been a monster, had a great game against Texas, and I expect something similar. In the secondary too, I thought the secondary stepped up. They had a rough showing against Mississippi State, bounced back against Texas, did a very good job there. And, kind of looking at the weaknesses, it goes to the inside linebackers, like I said, and it's maybe not so much a weakness, but a big question for the first half on Saturday. Dan Jackson and Jonell Aguero will miss the first half because of targeting penalties they had in the fourth quarter against Texas. How are those guys that are behind them going to step up? I expect KJ Bolden, a former 5-star, to be the starting safety alongside Malachi Starks. And then for Ja'Cory Thomas, a guy that's been in and out, that's been a pretty significant or pretty consistent contributor this year, to start at the star. So I'd say that's sort of more of the question is, how do those guys respond? Does DJ Lagway in Florida try to test those guys, especially Ja'Cory Thomas? I think everybody knows that KJ Bolden had such a big recruitment, a guy that a lot of people wanted, and he's shown talent. This is going to be probably the most snaps he's played as a Bulldog, but I think Georgia feels pretty good as far as Bolden's concerned.
I got to ask a little bit of an interesting question here, and, no pressure. You don't have to give a perfect answer, even though that's usually what you do. But from a coaching standpoint here, this is a fascinating game to me, because Billy Napier is so heavily speculated upon about, is this game going to be his last? Is he going to be able to save his job? That I think it's no secret that a win over Georgia would be massive for his odds of saving his job here. But this is a game that, and I hope the SEC doesn't sue me for using this phrase. I know coaches are always saying, well, every game's important. If I had $1 for every time I heard that, I'd be a lot richer than I am. I'm not going to tell you my financial wealth right now, but I would like those dollars, obviously. But this is a game that does seem to mean a little bit more to Kirby Smart. I mean, everyone, I think, remembers the coaching locker room speech that leaked a couple years ago. He has obviously got some experience in this game here. Do you think that, for a Georgia team coming off a massive win over, the number one ranked Texas team, is there any chance that from a coaching standpoint here, that even though Florida has their issues, that somehow Florida's coaching staff gets the better of Georgia in some facet, just knowing what this means for Napier and his coaching staff? Or do you think that Kirby Smart's passion for this game is just too much to overcome? I mean, Billy Napier's a guy who grew up in Georgia. He wouldn't say who he rooted for, but I think some fans may have some speculation here. It seems like Kirby really hates Florida. Do you think that how much this game means to Kirby Smart will allow Georgia to avoid any form of a letdown here, or underestimating the opponent here? Do you think that's even a possibility, just given what we know about Kirby Smart and how much this game means?
I don't think so. I mean, one, Kirby's played in it, and I think it's important to remember when Kirby was playing in this rivalry, Florida was kicking Georgia's ass. I mean, there's no other way to say it. I mean, Florida dominated this rivalry in the '90s into the 2000s, and I think that clip that leaked of the pregame speech. I mean, I really think Kirby meant every word of that. Now, he did a very good job this week of really playing down where this rivalry stands. He said, this is neck and neck with all our other rivalries, really played it down. I guarantee you, Graham, on Saturday, we're going to hear from some players. Let's say if Georgia wins this game, and they're going to say like, yeah, Kirby talks about how much it means to beat Florida and, how great it feels and stuff like that. Kind of having some fun after the fact. But I think, two, you consider Georgia's coming off a bye. They traditionally have been very successful under Kirby Smart in those conditions. You talk about what it means to some of the players. Carson Beck is from Jacksonville. He went to Mandarin High School. I think he wants to come in here and not only have a good game basically in his backyard, but kind of back to the conversation we were having earlier. He wants to show that, look, I haven't played my best, but I had a break. I had a week to kind of get things figured out, and I'm feeling good. Can talk about Trevor Etienne playing his former team. I think that he's going to be involved quite a bit in this offense, see what he's able to do. Talk about those guys on defense that I mentioned, KJ Bolden, Ja'Cory Thomas. They're going to get more opportunities than they're used to. Can they make the most of it? And then another guy, Jordan Hall, who I mentioned, probably making his season debut. He's from Jacksonville. I'm sure he really wants to get out there and make an impact. I think when you consider all the different factors in that regard, that it's just one of those Georgia's not going to sleep on. I think they know that this Florida team is dangerous. They saw what Florida did at Tennessee. They recognize that this is a hungry team that would love nothing more than to upset Georgia and put them on the brink of not making the playoff. I think Georgia takes this one seriously. I think it starts at the top with Kirby Smart, and I think you'll see that on Saturday.
Yeah, then you have the added element of Georgia's going to be playing in front of recruits, right? Which you always know that, especially a little bit new in this rivalry, is that that's something they get to do now. And for Georgia, I don't think that they're going to want to avoid any form of letdown whatsoever here. Is it time for us to get into predictions? I'm already sweating given mine here. I mentioned, fans hating me at Swamp 247 for bringing up Trevor Etienne. They're probably going to hate me for my prediction as well here, even if they can probably predict my prediction.
Well, I want to start before we give the actual predictions, Graham, and ask you, and I'll follow when you finish your answer. What has been the conversation this week, both about Trevor, but also just Georgia in general and getting ready for this game?
Yeah, the messaging. You mentioned Kirby Smart's messaging and showing respect for the opponent and saying that every game matters. I think for Florida, it's been a little bit different because they've acknowledged how much this win would mean. And maybe that's a sign of where the program is right now, because when you're on top, you get to say, hey, well, this isn't going to be the only top team we face. We respect everybody. But if you're Florida, given the circumstances, you've come out and say that this game means a lot. And Billy Napier, he said, quite frankly, this rivalry was at the top of ones that he's experienced. He's been at Clemson, he's been at Alabama, and having watched this one as a kid, following his dad around, who was a high school coach, he told a story last night about before they'd watched the game, and he had kind of a divided family with his mom, being a diehard Alabama fan, and his dad kind of being his dad's side, all Tennessee fans. That he said that they were pretty neutral despite living in Georgia, but before they'd watch the game, they'd have to drive out, pull up to exit 52 and trade high school tape with the coaches, and then be like, all right, are we ready to go to this game? So that absolutely has been a factor in this conversation, because there's a little bit of a personal connection. But for Trevor Etienne, I can say this very confidently. This is no secret, but Florida didn't want to lose him, right? And so I think that that's an aspect here where this isn't one of the attritions that you'd like if you're Florida here. And several times this season, Billy Napier has either alluded to Trevor Etienne leaving, or he's been asked about it, and he hasn't really mentioned the guy by name. And I'm not trying to put, words in Napier's mouth, but I do think that speaks volumes about how he feels about the guy leaving, and Trevor feeling like he's in a better place here, because you not only didn't want to lose him, but you did everything you could to keep him. And even when they were talking about UCF rusher RJ Harvey earlier in the season here, Napier said, it kind of reminds me of a running back that we used to have here. He plays elsewhere, kind of one of those things where you're referencing your ex-girlfriend, but you don't want to give her, any time of day, or have her, name come out of your mouth after the fact here. It's kind of one of those things that, Florida is clear how they feel. And I think from how good Trevor is, it should be no secret that they didn't want to lose him, even if they have capable running backs on their roster. So there's a personal element there as well in the game. That's the era of college football that we're in. The Gators face 10 former players this year, and Trevor is just another one of them, but he probably is at the top of the ones that they didn't want to lose here. And then you mentioned the Jacksonville connection. A lot of these guys who, from the north, part of Florida, even South Georgia, grew up playing against each other, know each other, are from the Jacksonville area, grew up going to this game here. That's part of why it's great that the game is in Jacksonville, because you do have a lot of players within the recruiting radiuses of both programs who have that personal connection here. So that is always an interesting thing to me. I don't know if this game means enough to the point, and sorry, Georgia fans, for bringing this up, to the point where if Florida scores a touchdown early, that you're going to see the entire sideline clear and go into the end zone. But if that happened, man, that would kind of be some overdue vengeance in my mind. I don't know if it'll translate to the entirety of the game there, but there are probably some fans out there who've been waiting for that one to see Florida kind of pull that off a little bit and give Georgia some comeuppance there.
Looking at it from the Georgia side, starting with Trevor Etienne, we did not get Trevor Etienne this week. Shocked that we weren't able to talk to him before this game, but we'll probably get him afterwards. But, I do think Kirby made a good point that they've had other players play in this situation. Dominic Lovett, who came over from Missouri, he actually had a touchdown against Missouri in Athens last year. He said, the biggest thing is you can't really focus on those connections, just stay in the moment. If you worry about playing your former team, that's not going to help you. Elsewhere, I think that Kirby was being really honest, talking about that he thinks this Florida team is playing its best football, and I think you've seen that in the results. I think they understand DJ Lagway is really dangerous. I think they understand that these receivers, even with Eugene Wilson unavailable, has the potential to generate big plays. And, we talked about this, Graham, earlier in the week when we popped on over at CBS Sports talking about this game. I think it boils down to Georgia has to limit the explosives for Florida. You can't let DJ Lagway make those big plays, especially early. I think Georgia's got a quiet confidence. They know they got to show up and take care of business, but they know Lagway's dangerous, and I don't think you're going to catch them sleepwalking in this game. Now, looking at this actual game, Graham, let's say things go well for Florida. What do you think has to happen? What do the Gators have to do, have to accomplish to have a shot at winning this thing?
I mean, where do I start? Can I say everything? Is that an easy cop-out? I mean, it comes down to just every facet of the game. DJ Lagway has to be explosive while limiting turnovers. That's a tall task for a freshman. The ground game has to get going against probably the best defensive front that they faced all season long. They have to be able to block effectively. They have to capitalize when there are opportunities. to connect with wide receivers. They have to move the football. They have to pick up, first downs and extend drives. And special teams, there can't be any miscues. That was an absolute issue for Florida last season, just costly opportunities against Arkansas, against Missouri as well. They have to be able to be solid in that facet of the game. They allowed a kickoff return touchdown last week to Barry and Brown. I mean, a lot of teams have, so not a massive indictment, but that is an area where Florida has to be solid. You can't give, an inch to the opponent when you have a very small margin of error like this Florida team has. And then defensively, I mentioned Jason Marshall Jr. being out. They had a lot of coverage lapses last year. You can't afford those against Carson Beck. Even if he was inaccurate 2 weeks ago, you know how capable he is, has had a couple of 400-yard passing performances this season alone, I believe. You can't allow him to do that. And I think that the ground game as well, Florida's run defense hasn't been incredible. They're going to need to be able to plug up holes and limit the damage, get off the field on third down. Again, did I miss any aspects? They're going to have to do every single one of those things to even have a good chance in this game. And you're going to have to win the turnover battle if you're Florida. I mean, thankfully for them, they're coming off their best takeaway performance of the year. This is a defense that only had 3 takeaways all of last year. Well, they had 3 against Kentucky last week, but they also need to get better at punching the football out, uppercutting the football out, get the ball on the ground, win some of those 50-50 balls, hope one bounces their way. You can't afford to rely solely on the Georgia offense to make mistakes here. Otherwise, your odds of getting that upset are very small in my mind. So they're going to have to do almost everything right. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention coaching. The Tennessee loss, quite frankly, was a very winnable game for Florida, but there were some head-scratching decisions, to put it lightly, in that contest, whether it was not going for 2 at the end of regulation, running an end around on 4th and a couple centimeters, running, Graham Mertz on a quarterback sneak there. When you got a 6'3", 240-pound quarterback that you could easily bring in there. There were a lot of decisions that probably came back to bite Florida in that contest. So this has to be the most well-coached performance this season for Billy Napier and company. And if they do all those things and they can put all that in the melting pot, you may have a recipe for success if you're Florida. But man, talk about a tall task, right?
For sure. And looking on the Georgia side, limiting those explosives, as I said earlier, getting after DJ Lagway. Again, the pass rush had its best game of the season at Texas. Even if you can't quite replicate that, getting after him, and I think especially early, can you rattle a true freshman? Can you get him off his game? I think is really important. And then one that you hit on for Florida is the turnover battle. I mean, it killed Georgia at Alabama, 4 turnovers. And then it helped Texas hang around with 3 turnovers in that game that Georgia wound up winning by 15. So those are the big ones to me. And then just sure special teams. They've played really well in special teams this year. But if you're going to give Florida a chance, I think it comes with missed field goals. I think it comes with poor punting, things like that. If you have mistakes in that third phase of the game, you leave yourself vulnerable against a team that is really, really hungry. All right, Graham, let's give a prediction on this game. How do you see this playing out? Give me a score, and I'll follow up with mine.
Yeah, I'm nervous, man. No one kill me, please. I think this is going to be tough for Florida to pull out. I think that I just mentioned everything they'd have to do right. Even if they do, 7 out of 10 things right, is that enough to beat this Georgia team? I wasn't lying when I thought this game means more to Kirby Smart. I mean, he wants to kick Florida's ass, like you said. And I think that Billy Napier understands everything that is at stake for him. But does that mean more than sheer hatred? I don't think so. So I'm going to go, and I think Florida offense will have some success, but I have no confidence in Florida's defense being able to entirely shut down this Georgia offense. So as of right now, I'm going Georgia 35, Florida 20. And I think it's going to be closer than people think in the first half here. But the key for me is that Florida has not been a great middle 8 team with Billy Napier. I think they'll keep it close early, maybe even could have a lead. But I think you're going to see Georgia start to pull away. Like you said, they're going to get some pieces back in the secondary for the second half. Kirby's going to go into the locker room, probably break a few whiteboards, and they're going to run out of the tunnel and outscore Florida there in the second half. Once Florida gets out of the scripted sequences and has to rely on either rallying behind a freshman quarterback or, limiting this Georgia attack here, which they're banged up in multiple spots, and they're going to have to rely on young players, and some guys going to have to play heavy amount of snaps. Is that going to be enough to close out a game against this extremely capable Georgia team? I'm not confident in it right now. I think it's going to be close early, like I said, but I still think Florida loses by double digits, and that you're going to enter Sunday with this conversation about, hey, what is the future look like at Florida with Billy Napier? Are we getting to a point of where it's inevitable that they part ways? I mean, a win here, people are going to start, drawing up the contract extension. I kid, Florida fans. I'm not serious in that, but this is going to absolutely be a very difficult game for Florida to win. A win would go a long way, but a loss is a lot more likely in my mind, and a double-digit one at that. Where do you stand?
Yeah, I think we're all kind of in line over here at Dawgs 24/7. I've got Georgia 37-17. I think Florida's going to hang around, but I just think that this is a chance for Carson Beck to bounce back. I'm going to say Trevor Etienne scores twice, kind of rubbing the salt in the wound there. So, yeah, I got 37-17. Ben Wolk's got a little bit closer, 34-22. Georgia wins. I think that's a respectable outcome if that's how it plays out. And Kip Adams has Georgia 34-17. So several of these have sort of been around that line. The last I saw was about 16.5. But I've got 37-17, and we'll make for some interesting conversations around Gainesville if it plays out that way. Well, Graham, let's get ready to wrap this up, but I want to set you up. Let us know what you guys got going on at Swap 24/7 and anything we should be on the lookout for the next few days.
Yeah, I really appreciate you having me on. You do a fantastic job. Dawgs 247 subscribers are extremely lucky that you guys and Kip and Ben are out there covering this team every single day. We got a lot of recruiting content coming over at Swamp 247 as well. If you've been following some of the speculation about flips, how Florida's class is going to close, we got all the information over at Swamp 247. Blake Alderman does a fantastic job. If you're a fall baseball fan, looking forward to that Fall Ball Classic on Friday. Jacob Rudner will be out there for us, so make sure you follow his coverage as well on social media at Jacob Rudner or at the Swamp 247 message board. And basketball, my friend, this is my favorite month of the year. November is the best month of the year because you not only have football, but you have the start of basketball. It's difficult to get some sleep here. I'm very much looking forward to it. Can't wait for it. Absolutely. It's going to be an exciting time. I think a lot of Florida fans who are tuned into football are really looking forward to basketball starting because the Gators look like that they have a really exciting team. And I know that Mike White over there has built a sneaky good squad. I like a lot of players on that Georgia team. I think they're going to be better than a lot of people think. So I know that we're going to link back up when it gets closer to that Georgia game here in January. I believe it's January 25th. I don't have it circled on my calendar or anything, but I think I just got the date right.
Yeah, it should be a good one, and I agree with you. And Florida men's basketball, I think, is going to be a handful for a lot of teams. And I want to shout out you, Graham, and also Jacob, and all you guys at Swamp 24/7. I really enjoy following y'all's coverage. Y'all do such a great job, and super excited to see you guys in Jacksonville on Saturday.
Likewise, man. Got to get out of here before I blush a little bit too hard. But looking forward to a great game on Saturday. I'm sure that we'll have a lot to talk about in the near future.
Definitely. We'll wrap it up right there for everyone on the Georgia fan side. Go to Dawgs 24/7, subscribe to our YouTube, subscribe to our TikTok. Make sure and subscribe to the Junkyard Dawgcast. All kinds of good content with the experts out there like Graham Hall that take the time to come on and tell us about their team. Super excited to get this one underway on Saturday, and we know you guys are as well. So for Graham Hall, I'm Jordan Hill. Until next time, take care, everybody.